The bass from the sound system upstairs vibrated through the floorboards, a rhythmic, mocking heartbeat that pulsed against the crown of her head. It was her 80th birthday, though the crowd gathered in the grand ballroom above cared very little about the milestone itself. They cared about the appearance of it. They cared about the vintage champagne, the catered truffles, and the high society networking that a matriarch's octogenarian celebration justified. But as the laughter drifted down through the vents, muffled and elite, she sat on the edge of a rusted cot in the dark. They had called it a transition. Her grandson, with his perfectly tailored suit and his clinical, unblinking eyes, had guided her down the concrete steps just an hour before, his grip on her elbow firm enough to compel obedience, but gentle enough to mimic care. "The stairs are getting dangerous for you," he had whispered, a practiced lie that tasted of corporate mercy. "We need the upper suites for the investors this weekend, just until things settle." But they both knew the truth. She was being archived. She was a piece of inconvenient history, tucked away where the dust could collect, without ruining the aesthetic of the family's newly inherited empire. The basement did not have a name, nor did it possess the dignity of finished walls. It was a sprawling subterranean cavern beneath the northern wing of the estate, heavy with the suffocating scent of damp concrete, weeping masonry, and the sharp, medicinal tang of rotting cedar chests. The air down here was static, frozen in a permanent winter that smelled of decades of abandonment. A single, bare bulb hung from a frayed black cord, casting long, skeletal shadows across stacks of water-damaged tax ledgers and broken heirloom furniture. It was a graveyard for things that had outlived their usefulness. She pulled her knitted wool shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders, her fingers tracing the frayed edges. Her hands were patterned with the pale, faded scars of old labor, the phantom burns from the factory floor, where she had worked 18-hour shifts in her youth, to buy the very land this estate now stood upon. She had poured her blood into the foundation of this family. She had traded the beauty of her youth and the resilience of her spine to build a legacy that her descendants now wore like a cheap coat. Yet, the moment the ink on the property transfers had dried, her value had plummeted to zero. It was a terrifying revelation how easily a lifetime of devotion could be erased by the simple passage of time. To her children and grandchildren, she was no longer the architect of their fortune. She was merely a lingering expense, a liability with a fading memory. They looked at her and saw a relic of a bygone era, an obsolete model occupying prime real estate. The legacy she had bled for had become a weapon used to lock her away. The silence of the basement was absolute, broken only by the sporadic, thunderous applause from the ballroom directly overhead. Someone was giving a speech, probably her son, praising the family's deep roots and historic resilience to an audience of strangers who only cared about the net worth of the name. The bitter irony washed over her like a cold wave. They celebrated the tree while cutting away the root that fed it. She looked at her lone suitcase sitting by the door, a battered leather piece that had traveled with her across oceans when she still had a future. It looked absurdly small against the vast, dark emptiness of the cellar. A lifetime of memories reduced to 40 pounds of clothing and a few faded photographs. She felt a profound, aching hollowness, not of grief, but of absolute erasure. She was alive, but she had been given a ghost's domain. Yet, as the music upstairs shifted to a slower, sweeping waltz, a song she vaguely remembered dancing to when her heart was young and the world was wide, she refused to let her head bow. They wanted her to fade into the shadows, to become as silent and compliant as the concrete walls around her. But as she stared into the deep, unmapped darkness stretching toward the far end of the basement, a spark of stubborn defiance flickered in her chest. They had forgotten who she was. They had forgotten that she was the one who knew how to build out of nothing, and in the quiet, damp isolation of her exile, she began to realize that the dark did not just hide the things the family had thrown away, it hid the things they were never smart enough to find. The echoes of the celebration upstairs began to dim, muffled by the sheer density of the stone foundation, until they became nothing more than a faint, ghostly vibration beneath her feet. The isolation was total now. She stood up from the rusted cot, the cold of the concrete floor biting through the thin soles of her slippers. She refused to sit there and let the dampness settle into her bones. If this subterranean wilderness was to be her final home, she would map its borders. Holding her breath against the heavy scent of mildew, she moved past her lone suitcase and ventured deeper into the unlit corners of the cellar. The beam of the single hanging bulb faded quickly, throwing her into a world of deep, velvety shadows. She navigated by touch, her fingers brushing against the rough canvas of old tarps and the collapsing cardboard of forgotten moving boxes. The family had used this space as a dumping ground for generations, piling their discarded history in chaotic mounds that blocked the path like ancient ruins. She pushed past a particularly tall wall of stacked, water-damaged crates, expecting to find nothing but another dead end of rotting drywall. Instead, her hand met something impossibly cold, smooth, and unyielding. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out again, her palms tracing a surface that didn't belong in a neglected basement. It wasn't stone, and it wasn't wood. It was steel. The suffocating weight of her despair vanished in an instant, replaced by a sharp, electric jolt of curiosity. She cleared away a heavy stack of moldering ledger books, throwing them aside with a strength she didn't know her 80-year-old arms still possessed. As the debris cleared, the bare bulb's distant light caught a reflection. Standing before her was a massive, seamless steel door, embedded directly into the bedrock of the estate's foundation. It was an engineering marvel, completely out of place amid the surrounding decay. But what drew her gaze was its pristine condition. Unlike the boxes and the walls, there was not a single speck of dust on its surface. No cobwebs clung to its edges. It looked as though it had been polished that very morning. In the center of the door sat a heavy mechanical brass dial, its intricate numerical etchings gleaming softly in the dark. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, youthful rhythm. She knew this craftsmanship. She recognized the precise, elegant geometry of the metalwork. Her trembling fingers reached down to the collar of her dress. Beneath the wool shawl, suspended on a delicate leather cord, hung an old brass key. It was a bizarre, heavy thing, shaped with unusual ridges that had never fit any lock in the main house above. It had been his final gift to her, given on a quiet, rainy evening decades ago, just days before he passed away. "Keep it close," he had whispered, his voice already fading. "When the world grows too small, it will open the way." She had worn it for 40 years as a keepsake, a useless token of a love the rest of the family had mocked as eccentric and impractical. They had called him a madman who wasted his genius on impossible blueprints. Now, staring at the brass dial, she saw a keyhole hidden perfectly within the central axis of the mechanism. The realization washed over her with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't left her unprotected. He had foreseen this exact moment. She lifted the cord over her head, the brass key feeling heavy and warm in her palm. Her hand shook as she stepped closer to the seamless steel barrier, the tip of the key hovering just millimeters away from the lock. The air around the door felt different, charged with a faint, kinetic energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, a seamless marriage of metal and intent. Taking a deep breath, she braced her fragile frame and turned it. There was no grinding of rust, no stiff resistance of neglected gears. Instead, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the steel, followed by the heavy, incredibly satisfying click of a long-dormant machine waking up. Internal deadbolts slid back one by one with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that sounded like a countdown. The heavy brass dial began to spin on its own, clicking through a sequence of pre-programmed coordinates. She stepped back as the seamless seam of the door fractured, a thin line of warm, brilliant light piercing the darkness of the basement. A gentle hiss of pressurized air escaped from the seal, carrying with it a scent that made her eyes sting with sudden tears, the unmistakable, sharp fragrance of fresh jasmine and polished beeswax, a scent that belonged entirely to him. The heavy steel door swung inward without a single groan, moving as smoothly as a curtain rising on an opening night. She braced herself for the sight of a cramped vault or a dusty safe, but the reality that met her eyes made her stop breathing entirely. She did not look into a dark, subterranean crawl space. Instead, she was staring into a breathtaking, sun-drenched foyer that seemed to defy every law of physics and architecture. The brilliant light made her squint, her eyes unaccustomed to anything but the dim amber glow of the cellar's solitary bulb. As her vision cleared, she took a hesitant step forward, crossing the threshold from the damp concrete into an impossible sanctuary. Her slippers sank slightly into a plush, cream-colored wool rug that gave way to beautifully polished mahogany floors. The wood gleamed with a deep, rich luster, reflecting the golden light that poured from the interior. The scent she had caught a hint of earlier now enveloped her completely, a rich, comforting wave of fresh jasmine and clean beeswax, a fragrance so intensely tied to her memories of him that she felt as though she had stepped backward through time. She stood in the entry hall of a magnificent, mid-century modern villa. The clean lines, the minimalist teak furniture, and the low-slung, elegant geometry of the space were unmistakable. It was his signature style, the exact aesthetic he had championed before the family forced him into early retirement. But this was no ordinary house. As she walked deeper into the foyer, looking up at the exposed structural beams and the flawless titanium framing, she realized the entire structure was suspended. It sat within a vast, expertly engineered cavern carved directly out of the deep bedrock, held aloft by a sophisticated system of massive pneumatic shocks and heavy-duty steel tracks. It was a completely self-contained, mobile masterpiece, hidden away like a crown jewel beneath the very earth they had discarded her upon. The true marvel, however, lay just beyond the foyer in the expansive living room. The entire perimeter of the villa was flanked by huge, panoramic smart windows that stretched from the polished floor to the high ceiling. Through these glass panels, there was no sign of dirt, rock, or structural pillars. Instead, her eyes were met with a sweeping, hyper-realistic view of a sun-kissed Tuscan countryside. Rolling green hills dotted with ancient cypress trees stretched out toward a distant, hazy mountain range. The sky above was a vibrant canvas of deep orange, soft pink, and bruised violet, a perfectly simulated golden hour that bathed the entire interior of the villa in a warm, eternal twilight. The illusion was so absolute, so masterfully rendered, that she could see the gentle sway of the digital wheat fields in a phantom breeze and the slow, lazy descent of a simulated sun. The atmosphere was profoundly cinematic, a grand and beautiful theater designed for an audience of one. The sheer scale of the space and the warmth of the artificial sun on her face washed away the last traces of the chill that had settled into her bones upstairs. A deep, aching nostalgia swelled in her chest, so heavy it made her knees tremble. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a love letter written in glass, steel, and timber. It was a sanctuary built by a man who had known, even then, that the world above would eventually grow too cold for her. She walked slowly toward the panoramic window, her fingers reaching out to touch the glass. It felt warm to the touch, vibrating with a very faint, almost imperceptible electronic hum. The high-resolution display adjusted perfectly to her movements, shifting the perspective slightly as she leaned closer, creating a flawless sense of three-dimensional depth. For 80 years, she had watched her world shrink, moving from a bustling neighborhood to a quiet room, and finally to a nameless basement. But here, within the belly of the earth, he had given her an infinite horizon. The silence within the villa was not the dead, suffocating quiet of the cellar. It was a living, breathing stillness. The air was crisp, perfectly climate-controlled, and carried the subtle, rhythmic sound of a high-end ventilation system that mimicked the gentle rustle of a summer evening. There was no bass vibrating through the ceiling here. The chaotic, greedy world of her descendants had been completely severed. She was entirely alone, yet for the first time in decades, she did not feel lonely. She felt seen. She felt protected by a legacy that had survived the passage of time, waiting patiently in the dark for her to turn the key. She moved deeper into the suspended villa, her footsteps making a soft, rhythmic rhythm against the flawless mahogany floors. Every corner she turned, every angle of the architecture, revealed his unmistakable touch. The built-in walnut bookshelves, the low-profile leather sofas, and the subtle brass accents were a living catalog of his mind. He had been a brilliant, eccentric engineer, a man who looked at a barren plot of land and saw a canvas for miracles. Yet, the family had never understood him. They had dismissed his blueprints as the erratic doodles of a dreamer, eventually forcing him out of the family firm when his designs became too visionary, too expensive, too untamed for their narrow corporate minds. They wanted predictable concrete boxes, He wanted to build sanctuaries. Now she realized exactly where all that dismissed genius had gone. He hadn't stopped building after they cast him aside. He had simply gone underground. The villa was immaculate, preserved in a state of eternal readiness. She walked past a state-of-the-art kitchen with seamless brushed steel appliances, a bathroom lined with heated slate tiles, and a bedroom where a heavy silk duvet was neatly pressed and waiting. It was built entirely for her, tailored to her exact preferences, right down to the height of the countertops and the specific amber warmth of the recessed lighting. He had mapped her comfort into the very bones of the structure. When she reached the open-concept dining area, her breath caught. Resting in the exact center of a grand, live-edge oak dining table sat a thick, leather-bound journal and a heavy cylinder of rolled drafting paper. A solitary pinlight from the ceiling illuminated them like artifacts in a museum. She approached the table, her hands trembling as she reached for the drafting cylinder. She unrolled the thick, heavy paper, weighting the edges with her hands. The top sheet was a master schematic, drawn with the meticulous, razor-sharp ink lines he was famous for. In the bottom right corner, written in his elegant, sweeping cursive, was the title, The Sanctuary Project, a mobile, autonomous habitat. Beneath it, a secondary note read, For her when the house above grows cold. Tears blurred her vision as she set the blueprints down and reached for the leather journal. The leather was supple, smelling of oil and old paper. She opened the cover, and there, on the first page, his handwriting spoke to her across a chasm of decades. My dearest, the entry began, dated only a few months before his sudden passing. If you are reading this, then the inevitable has happened. The vultures have finally taken the upper floors, and they have left you with nothing but the dust. I knew their greed would eventually blind them to the only real treasure this family ever possessed, you. They see the world through ledger sheets and profit margins. They never understood that a true legacy isn't something you display to impress strangers. It is something you build to protect the ones you love. She sank into one of the plush dining chairs, her fingers tracing the ink of his words, as if she could feel the pulse of his hand through the paper. He had foreseen it all. He had watched their children and grandchildren grow up with hearts of stone, obsessed with status and wealth, and he knew that once he was gone, she would eventually be viewed as an inconvenience. They thought I was spending my final years chasing ghosts in the cellar, the text continued. Let them believe it. Let them build their empire of paper on top of this rock. While they negotiated their petty deals, I carved out a world where their rules do not apply. This villa is entirely self-sustaining. It draws geothermal power from the deep crust, purifies its own water through an artesian well beneath the bedrock, and utilizes a closed-loop atmospheric system. It is a fortress disguised as a home, built upon a heavy rail transit chassis that accesses the old abandoned industrial tunnels from the turn of the century. It is a legacy meant only for the one who truly valued my mind, the only one who never called me crazy. The depth of his foresight was staggering. He hadn't just built a bunker, he had designed an escape velocity. He had given her a fully functioning, luxurious ecosystem hidden directly beneath the feet of the people who thought they had stripped her of her dignity. The absolute irony of it filled her with a sudden, sharp amusement that cut through her grief. Her family was upstairs right now, clinking glasses and celebrating their inherited wealth, entirely unaware that the most valuable piece of engineering on the continent was sitting directly beneath their floorboards, belonging entirely to an old woman they had thrown away like trash. She closed the journal, holding it tightly against her chest. The heavy weight of her 80 years seemed to lift from her shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of vindication. She was no longer a victim of her family's neglect. She was the sole custodian of a masterpiece. He had loved her with an intensity that outlived his own heartbeat, and through his forgotten legacy, he had just handed her the keys to her own kingdom. Holding the leather journal tightly against her ribs, she stood up from the oak table and walked toward the main living area, where a sleek, low-profile control console was integrated into a brushed titanium pillar. The interface was elegant and entirely mechanical, devoid of the confusing touchscreens that her grandchildren used to make her feel obsolete. It featured weighted brass switches, analog gauges that glowed with a soft amber light, and a heavy, deeply notched central dial made of polished walnut and steel. It was a machine designed to be felt, to be operated with intention.
She stood before the console, her fingers hovering over the central dial. According to his journal, this was the heart of the villa's atmospheric matrix. The basement around her was no longer a tomb of concrete and neglect. It had been transformed into a staging ground for a grand, triumphant reclamation of her life. She was no longer the frail woman her family had managed out of sight. She was a captain at the helm of an impossible vessel. Slowly, she gripped the walnut dial. It turned with a heavy, oiled resistance, a series of deep, mechanical clicks echoing through the quiet room. As the dial clicked 3 times to the right, the simulated Tuscan landscape outside the panoramic smart windows began to dissolve. The rolling green hills and the golden twilight fractured into a cascade of brilliant, fluid light, shifting from warm amber to a deep, dramatic oceanic blue. The transformation was seamless and total. Within seconds, the eternal afternoon of Italy vanished, replaced by the rugged, windswept cliffs of Big Sur, California. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she stepped closer to the glass. The simulation was breathtakingly absolute. Huge, jagged walls of dark granite plunged down into a roiling, hyper-realistic Pacific Ocean. Great, white-crested waves crashed violently against the rocks below, sending up plumes of digital spray that looked so tangible she could almost feel the moisture on her skin. Above the cliffs, a dense, heavy blanket of coastal fog rolled slowly over the highway, illuminated by the pale, majestic silver of a rising full moon. But it wasn't just the visual fidelity that made her heart soar. It was the sensory synthesis. The villa's climate control system shifted instantly. The air in the living room grew crisp and cool, carrying the sharp, unmistakable scent of wild sage, damp redwood bark, and the heavy brine of the cold Pacific tide. A subtle, subaudible transducer beneath the floorboards began to hum, vibrating her slippers with the deep, low-frequency rumble of breaking surf. It was the exact spot where they had fallen in love 55 years ago. They had been young, penniless, and stuffed into the back of a battered station wagon, staring out at this very horizon while he sketched his first impossible architectural dreams on the back of greasy diner napkins. The family had told her then that marrying him was a mistake, that a man with his head in the clouds would never provide a stable foundation. Yet here she was, more than half a century later, standing inside the literal manifestation of his dreams, completely protected by the very mind they had dismissed. A triumphant, brilliant smile broke across her face, smoothing away the deep lines of sorrow that had etched themselves into her skin over the last few hours. The basement was no longer a prison. It was no longer the dark hole where her ungrateful bloodlines had sentenced her to fade away in silence. It was a gateway to a boundless, infinite world, a private theater where she could command the horizons at her whim. With a single turn of a dial, she had evicted her family from her reality, replacing their cold rejection with the warmest memories of her life. She walked over to a plush mid-century armchair positioned perfectly in front of the grand window, sinking into its soft leather. She watched the phantom fog dance across the cliffs of Big Sur, feeling a profound wave of dignity wash over her soul. They had thrown her into the dark, thinking it would break her spirit, completely unaware that the dark was where he had hidden the stars. She leaned her head back against the cushion, listening to the rhythmic and comforting roar of the artificial ocean, entirely free, completely sovereign, and ready for whatever world she decided to create next. Days passed in a blur of blissful, undisturbed isolation. She lost track of the mornings and evenings, letting her schedule be dictated only by the shifting digital horizons she chose from the console. She ate light, pristine meals from the self-replenishing pantry, read his journals by the warm light of a simulated Parisian sunrise, and slept deeply for the first time in years. The world above had ceased to exist until the ceiling rattled. The vibration was sudden and violent, a sharp reminder of the fragile boundary separating her sanctuary from the empire of greed upstairs. A heavy, metallic thud echoed through the structural beams of the cavern, followed by the muffled, scraping sound of footsteps on the concrete floor outside. Someone was in the basement. Through a discreet external security monitor mounted beside her control console, she watched the intrusion unfold. He had descended the stairs, the ungrateful grandson who had so smoothly engineered her exile with his corporate smiles and practiced lies. He was dressed down today, his expensive suit jacket tossed aside, his sleeves rolled up as he dragged a heavy, dust-covered steamer trunk across the cellar floor. He had likely come down to scavenge for more family heirlooms to sell off or liquidate, completely indifferent to the fact that he was invading the place where he had left his grandmother to rot. But as he pulled the trunk past the wall of collapsed cardboard boxes, he froze. The seamless steel door, which she had left slightly ajar to let the fresh scent of jasmine circulate, stood wide open, casting a brilliant, warm shaft of golden light across the dark, damp concrete of the cellar. The monitor captured the exact moment his composure fractured. His smug, calculated expression vanished, his jaw dropping in sheer, unadulterated shock. He dropped the handle of the steamer trunk, the heavy thud echoing through the vents as he stared at the impossible portal. For a long, tense minute, he didn't move, his eyes darting from the intricate brass dial to the pristine mahogany floorboards visible just beyond the threshold. Curiosity and greed are powerful motivators. Step by cautious step, he approached the opening, his boots leaving damp, dusty tracks on the threshold as he crossed into the villa's foyer. She stood perfectly still in the center of the living area, watching him enter her world. The tension in the air became thick, electric, and dangerous. As he fully stepped through the door, his eyes swept over the soaring architecture, the immaculate teak furniture, and the massive, panoramic smart windows, currently displaying a breathtaking, hyper-realistic view of the snow-capped Swiss Alps during a vivid crimson sunset. The sheer opulence of the space was blinding, an architectural masterpiece that defied every convention of modern engineering. It was a self-sustaining luxury estate, built inside a subterranean void, and she could practically see the mathematical equations and dollar signs spinning behind his eyes. The shock on his face rapidly morphed into something far more sinister. He didn't look around with wonder or reverence. He looked around with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had just stumbled upon an uncharted gold mine. To his hyper-commercial mind, this wasn't a grandfather's loving legacy, or a sanctuary for an elderly woman. It was a proprietary miracle. It was a multi-million-dollar patent waiting to be claimed, an engineering marvel to be stripped, marketed, and sold to the highest-bidding tech conglomerate or defense contractor. He took another step forward, his eyes locking onto her. The superficial deference he usually forced into his voice was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, aggressive intensity. He looked at her not as his grandmother, but as an obstacle standing between him and the greatest financial windfall of his life. What is this place? His voice cut through the alpine stillness of the room, sharp and demanding, stripped of the polished corporate veneer he usually wore. He walked toward her, his boots clicking heavily against the mahogany, his gaze darting frantically from the soaring structural beams to the vast, glowing panoramic windows. Who built this? How long has this been down here? She did not answer immediately. She stood by the control console, her hand resting lightly on the polished walnut dial, watching him with a calm, unblinking intensity. When his eyes fell upon the grand live-edge oak dining table, he stopped. The leather-bound journal and the heavy cylinder of blueprints were illuminated under the single pin light like sacred artifacts. He lunged toward them, his fingers twitching with a sudden, frantic desperation. "The schematics," he muttered, his breath catching as he unrolled the top sheet, his eyes devouring the precise, razor-sharp ink lines. "This is grandfather's work, the autonomous habitat system, the closed-loop atmospheric matrix. My God, the patents alone are worth a fortune." Suddenly, his demeanor shifted. The aggressive demand vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickeningly superficial reverence, driven entirely by greed. He turned to her, a wide, artificial smile stretching across his face, his eyes wide with a manic, performative warmth. "Grandma," he said, his voice dropping into a soft, soothing cadence that made her skin crawl. "This is incredible. You shouldn't be down here alone with something this valuable. This is a family asset. We can market this. We can build these for the tech elite, for the billionaires. You and I, we can secure the family's future for the next 3 generations. Just give me the journal. Let me take the blueprints upstairs so my legal team can look them over." He reached for the leather-bound book, his hand extending with an entitled confidence, fully expecting the frail, discarded old woman to comply as she always had. But she didn't move an inch. Instead, she stepped into his path, her slight frame instantly blocking his access to the table. She stood taller than she had in decades, her spine straightening with a sudden, commanding rigidity that seemed to catch him completely off guard. The frail, compliant matriarch they had managed out of sight was gone. In her place stood the woman who had survived the factories, the woman who had anchored a genius, the woman who knew exactly what everything in this world was truly worth. "You will not touch them," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a terrifying, resonant weight that echoed through the vast room. He blinked, his hand hovering in midair, a flicker of genuine irritation breaking through his fake smile. "Grandma, don't be ridiculous. You're 80 years old. What are you going to do with a subterranean rail system and a bunch of proprietary blueprints? You don't understand the market value of what's sitting here. This belongs to the firm now. It belongs to me," she countered, her gaze locking onto his with a fierce, burning clarity that forced him to take a half-step back. In that electric moment, a profound power shift occurred. Looking at his frantic, calculating eyes, she realized the ultimate truth of her journey. The true legacy her husband had left her wasn't the unimaginable wealth of the technology, nor was it the opulence of the suspended villa. The true legacy was the enduring, indestructible power of love and foresight. He had built this sanctuary to shield her from the very monster standing before her. He had given her a fortress of absolute sovereignty, a place where the transactional cruelty of her bloodline held absolutely no currency. "You see a gold mine," she said, her voice steady and cutting like a diamond through glass. "You see patents to sell and billionaires to please. You look at his life's work and all you can think about is how to strip it down and sell it to the highest bidder. You are exactly what he said you would be, a vulture." "I am trying to save this family," he snapped, his patience finally snapping as his face contorted into a mask of pure arrogance. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "You are an old woman living in a basement. If I take this by force, who are you going to tell? The investors upstairs? The board? They think you're losing your mind. Hand over the journal, Grandma. It's time to be realistic." She looked at him, feeling a sudden, deep sense of pity that was far more insulting than anger. He thought he was the one in control because he held the titles and the deeds to the house above. He didn't realize that he had walked into a world where his rules were entirely obsolete. She refused to let him desecrate his final masterpiece. She would not allow his greedy, clumsy hands to tarnish the one pure thing left in her life. She took a slow step backward, her hand returning to the control console behind her. Her fingers found the master sequence switch, a heavy brass lever hidden beneath the lip of the titanium pillar. She looked him dead in the eye, a serene, triumphant smile gracing her lips. "You think you locked me in a cage," she whispered, "but you forgot to check who held the key." Her grandson lunged forward, his hands reaching desperately for the blueprints on the table, but he was a second too late. Remembering a specific underlined passage from the leather-bound journal, her fingers moved with flawless, instinctive precision. She reached beneath the lip of the titanium console, flipping a hidden sequence of 3 heavy brass toggle switches, then gripped the master lever and threw it completely forward. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, the world began to move. A deep, subaudible hum vibrated from the very center of the earth, a massive kinetic awakening that resonated through the sole of her slippers. It wasn't a mechanical groan. It was a smooth, thrumming power, the sound of a sleeping titan opening its eyes. The resonant vibration escalated rapidly, shaking the massive bedrock cavern and traveling upward through the stone pillars, violently rattling the foundations of the grand estate above. Upstairs, the music would be stopping, the expensive champagne glasses shattering on the ballroom floor, and her greedy relatives panic-striking as their inherited empire trembled. But down here, within the villa, the structure remained perfectly level, cradled by its massive pneumatic stabilizers. Her grandson froze, his hands dropping from the paper as the floor beneath him surged. His face turned an ashen white as he clutched the edge of the dining table for balance. "What did you do?" he yelled over the rising roar of the machinery. "What is this?" The twist unfolded right before his terrified eyes. The villa was not a stationary bunker of hidden luxury. It was truly mobile. As the heavy-duty electromagnetic locks released with a series of thunderous pneumatic pops, the entire architectural masterpiece shifted backward. The cavern walls began to recede. The villa was built upon a massive, advanced subterranean rail system, an engineering miracle designed decades ago to connect directly to the old, forgotten network of underground transcontinental tunnels that stretched secretly beneath the country, long abandoned by the public but perfectly preserved by him. The villa began to move, gaining speed with an impossible liquid smoothness. Through the massive panoramic windows, the high-resolution simulation of the Swiss Alps deactivated, revealing the stark, breathtaking reality of the underworld. Massive, cavernous tunnels, carved out of solid granite, swept past, illuminated by the villa's own external floodlights. "No! Stop this! Stop the machine!" he screamed, completely unhinged now. He abandoned the blueprints and sprinted toward the foyer, his corporate arrogance entirely replaced by primal terror. He realized, with a sudden, agonizing clarity, that the tracks were leading away from the estate, away from the city, away from everything he could control or exploit. The heavy, seamless steel entrance door began to slide shut, its automated gears whistling as they sealed the perimeter. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice cutting through his panic with absolute, chilling sovereignty. He reached the threshold just as the gap was narrowing to a few feet. Panicking, realizing he would be trapped in an underground vessel hurtling into the deep dark, He made a desperate choice. He threw himself forward, tumbling awkwardly through the closing opening. He hit the concrete floor of the cellar hard, rolling into the dust and the mildewed boxes he had used to imprison her. Through the thick glass window of the inner door, she watched him scramble to his feet, coughing in the dust, his expensive clothing ruined, his hands scratching uselessly at the solid titanium barrier that had just locked him out forever. The villa glided away effortlessly, leaving him behind in the empty, decaying basement. He was left with a hollow house, a fractured foundation, and a mystery he would spend the rest of his life failing to solve. She stood tall at the console, watching his frantic, shrinking figure disappear into the blackness of the tunnel as her new journey began. The final pneumatic bolt slid into place with a definitive, ringing click that echoed through the foyer, locking the steel door forever from the inside. The seal was absolute. The connection to the estate above, to her ungrateful lineage, and to the lifetime of quiet exploitation she had endured, was severed completely. The villa moved with a gentle, hypnotic sway as it navigated the deep subterranean rail line, accelerating smoothly through the darkness of the earth. She walked away from the control console, leaving the switches exactly as he had intended them to be set. She picked up the leather-bound journal from the dining table, holding it close to her chest like a shield, and walked back to the living room. She sank into the plush leather armchair positioned perfectly before the grand panoramic window. For a while, she simply watched the external floodlights illuminate the rough, ancient granite of the underground tunnels sweeping past. Then, according to the automated coordinates pre-programmed into the ship's navigation, the dark stone walls began to slope upward. The tracks climbed a gentle, steady incline, rising toward the surface of a completely different world. Slowly, the overhead concrete of the tunnel system vanished, replaced by a massive, vaulted exit hidden inside a forgotten coastal bluff. The villa emerged from the belly of the earth, its wheels transitioning from the subterranean rails onto a reinforced, private foundation, embedded in the cliffside of a remote, uncharted stretch of Pacific coastline, hundreds of miles away from the city. As the vehicle settled into its final destination, the panoramic smart windows automatically switched off their digital simulations, transitioning into perfectly clear, transparent glass. She let out a long, quiet breath as she looked out at the real world. The simulated stars she had admired days before gave way to a genuine, breathtaking sunrise. The sky was an explosion of brilliant gold, soft lavender, and bruised rose, the colors bleeding into the endless horizon of the open ocean. Below the cliffs, real waves crashed against jagged rocks, sending a spray of white foam into the crisp morning air. The climate control system adjusted, drawing in the fresh, clean air of the coast, carrying the sharp, invigorating scent of pine needles and salt crust. Miles behind her, in the waking city, her family would be standing in a ruined, hollow house. They would be staring at a cracked foundation, an empty basement, and a massive steel door that would never open for them again. They would spend their lives arguing over property lines and lost assets, plagued by a mystery they were never smart enough to solve. They had thought they were archiving a relic of the past, completely unaware that they were releasing a force of nature. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, smoothing the tension from her brow. She opened the journal to the final page, where his handwriting offered one last benediction. "Welcome home, my love. The horizon is yours." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth of the genuine morning sun streaming through the glass, bathing her skin in a golden glow. She was 80 years old, yet she felt entirely reborn. The legacy her family had ignored and forgotten had become the very vehicle of her salvation. She was wrapped in the enduring warmth of a love that had outsmarted time itself. She was completely free, profoundly sovereign, and, for the first time in a very long time, she was finally home.